Good afternoon, esteemed members who have joined for this very special webinar organized by the GST and Indirect Taxes Committee of ICAI. I call this special because today we are having a speaker from Portugal. We are also going to hear her speak on the place of supply in the European Union value-added tax concept. On behalf of all of us, on behalf of the GST and Indirect Taxes Committee, I welcome Ms. Fatima to this special program organized by the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, the GST and Indirect Taxes Committee. Esteemed members, the GST or VAT, as the world may call it, more or less the principles based on which the levy of tax works is the same. The procedural aspects may differ. The place of supply concepts may differ based on the geographical location and based on the various other factors which work on the GST or the VAT. I have great pleasure in once again welcoming Fatima, who is known to me. Fatima will be officially introduced by the Secretary of the GST and Indirect Taxes Committee, Smita Mishra. But I have known Fatima for now a decade or so as a very, very active member of the International VAT Association, an active board member of the International VAT Association, an economist, and a person who has a very wide and deep understanding on the value-added tax concept, especially in the European Union. Welcome, Fatima, to India. I must put it like this. And it is this lockdown period which has helped us in bringing people like Fatima to all of us closer in terms of academic understanding and knowledge exchange. Friends, without wasting much time, may I now request our very efficient secretary, the academically strong person in our committee, CA Smita Mishra, to give a brief overview of the topic and also introduce formally Maria Fatima to all of us. Thank you very much. Over to you, Smita ji.
Thank you, sir. And welcome all of you to today's VCM on place of supply in EU VAT. And as sir said, place of supply, of course, is a very important and core concept of our GST law. And today we have with us a very renowned international expert on the concepts of VAT, which who will give us the international perspective of this important concept. Let me just introduce Madam Fatima to all of you. Madam Fatima is a Portuguese economist. She's a postgraduate in taxation. She holds a university degree in economics in the faculty of by the Faculty of Economics of Oporto. She has done a post-graduation in financial system management by Institute of Financial and Taxation Studies. She also holds a post-graduation in taxation by the Institute of Financial and Taxation Studies, Oporto. She has also done an executive course on tax and tax planning from the Portuguese Catholic University. She has been active with the International VAT Association Board and has made several presentations regarding international VAT issues, either at the IVA meetings and in other international tax forums. She has also been involved in lobbying activities on behalf of the International VAT Association and on the marketing activities of the association, including the organization of the virtual meetings and the planning of the new website of the International VAT Associations. She is also partner of Ecovis Comark LDA, a company that provides accounting, payroll, taxation, and HR services. So we are really fortunate to have you over here, ma'am, today. And you're all eagerly waiting to hear your insights on this important concept of GST.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. Shukriya. Now I'll try to share my screen. Let's see if I can do it. Okay, it seems that I got it.
Yes, that's fine. That's fine, Fatima. Thank you.
Good. It's always an important step. Thank you again very much for your presentation, and thank you for being with me on this Sunday afternoon. I'm sure that everybody would have nicer things to do, so thank you for your patience and your attention. In relation to the place of supply, I will address a specific part, which is the place of supply of services. So let's start. Okay, I would start by the basics. So what is the value-added tax? The VAT is a general consumption tax levied on the transfer of goods and the provision of services, and from a EU perspective on the intra-community purchases and imports. It is a multi-phase tax, so it's a tax that is paid on all stages of the economic circuit, from the producer to the retailers to the wholesalers. I mean, it covers all the phases. And it is a multi-phase tax. It's not cumulative. So the payment of the tax due is split by the various participants in the economic circuit through the tax credit method. VAT is intended to be neutral. I mean, in an ideal world, that would be what it should be. Because businesses, they can claim the tax incurred on any goods and services. So the ultimate payer of this tax is the consumer. The tax content of goods or service does not depend on the length of the production processes. It does not favor business vertical integration or discourages it. It does not lead to distortions in the production and distribution channels. Obviously, this, in an ideal world, we know that due to many other factors, this neutrality is not always achieved due to a number of situations like exemptions and others. VAT is also an indirect tax. So the taxable person is the one who pays the tax to the authorities, and not the consumer, who finally is the one that pays it. So the debtor of the tax does not coincide with the recipient of the tax. VAT is a single obligation tax. Tax experts distinguish single obligation tax from periodic obligation tax, like where the former are based on an instantaneous tax fact, which is the case of VAT, and the others are based on a lasting tax fact, which is the case of the corporate or personal income taxes. VAT is a French creation, according to some, and others say that it's a German creation. But let's give it that it's probably, we can consider it to be 50% French and 50% German. So where do we stand in terms of the place of supply? What is the state of the art of the place of supply nowadays? In order to understand where we are, where we've gotten to, we need to understand what has been the path followed by this topic of the place of supply. We need to understand the developments that occurred, at least in the European Union, since the creation of the EEC until today. So it's been a long road. There's been a few, one can say, a number of developments, and we need to start from the beginning. So the EEC was created through the Treaty of Rome that was signed in 1957. And one of the goals besides the political goals of the establishment of the European Economic Community, was to create a common market, which included a customs union through the suppression of customs duties, quantitative restrictions on imports, and other obstacles that prevented the trade between member states, and also a common customs tariff regarding any third countries. One other goal of creating the European Economic Community was the implementation of four major fundamental liberties: the free movement of industrial and agricultural goods, the free movement of persons, the free movement of capital, the freedom of establishment and of provision of services. So the implementation, the harmonization of VAT was a key aspect to ensure the accomplishment of the Treaty of Rome goals. The harmonization of VAT regulation aimed to avoid that member states implement fiscal policies that jeopardize the customs union goal. The need to avoid distortions on competition between the member states, and the implementation of the own resources regime of the community's budget. So, how did it start? The implementation of VAT in the then European Economic Community was done by mostly the two first directives. So the first directive, established in 1967, established the obligation of the adoption of the VAT in all EEC member states, and also its major guidelines. So at the time, only France had VAT. The other countries had other consumption taxes implemented, and it was fundamental that on this side of taxation there was more harmonization, and the VAT was adopted in all member states. So Article 1 of the first directive clearly states member states shall replace their present systems of turnover taxes by the common system of value-added tax defined in Article 2. And in this directive, it's also mentioned the principle of origin as the principle to be pursued. So on the basis of that, and in an ideal world, at least at the time, the purpose was that everything was taxed, so the taxation occurred where the supplier was established. And we can see that it would be interesting regardless of the location of the consumer or of the purchaser, the application, the VAT to be charged would be the one that was implemented in the country where the supplier was established. So if a supplier was established in France, regardless of the clients that he had, he would always charge French VAT. Simple and very quick to understand. That was the beauty of the principle of origin. So one can see the appeal that it contained. So Article 4 of this directive says, in order to enable the Council to discuss this, and if possible to take decisions before the end of the transitional period, the Commission shall submit proposals as how to and within what period of harmonization of turnover taxes can achieve the aim of abolishing the imposition of tax on importation and the remission of tax on exportation in trade between member states, while ensuring the neutrality of those taxes as regards the origin of the goods or services. In this connection, particular account shall be taken of the relationship between direct and indirect taxes, which differs in the various member states, of the effects of an alteration in tax systems, on the tax and budget policy of member states, and on the influence which tax systems have on conditions of competition and on social conditions in the community. The second directive, as the first and the second work together, the second directive referred to the harmonization of legislation of member states concerning turnover taxes structure and the procedures for the application of the common system of value-added tax. But this was only a start. Although it established rules regarding the tax base, it left a large margin of maneuver to the member states regarding the exemptions. And in what services is concerned, it only applied compulsorily to the services listed in the Annex B of the directive, which was a very restrictive number of services. So the beginnings of the VAT in the European Economic Community were difficult, and it takes 3 additional directives to get it implemented in all member states. So we have 3 additional directives, the 3rd, the 4th, and the 5th, which allow for the postponement of the implementation of VAT in the then member states of the European Economic Community. The first one, the 3rd directive, allows for the postponement of the implementation to the 1st of January of 1972. The 4th and the 5th allow for further postponements in the case of Italy, which the second one being to the 1st of January of 1973. And so on that date, the then 9 EEC member states have finally all implemented the VAT in accordance with these 2 first directives that established, for one, the obligation to implement VAT, and in the second directive, a number of rules that followed that implementation, but that still allowed for a large margin of maneuver for the member states in terms of exemptions and others. And so we had still a number of differences in the various member states. It is with the 6th directive, dated 1977, that there is a big move forward in terms of harmonization. Because obviously, although at the time there were only the EEC started with 6 countries, then 9, and eventually it became a larger union of countries. Political differences, differences on policies from a social point of view, all that were obstacles to a fuller harmonization. And so the harmonization, which is has not yet been fully attained these days, move forward from time to time with after the agreement between member states. So this 6th directive established a uniform basis of assessment. It implied also, obviously, a common set of rules. So besides the concepts of taxable person, of supply of goods, provision of services, importation of goods that were already established, regarding compulsory extension of taxation at retail level and the entirety of services, harmonization also on the level of exemptions, taxable value, harmonization of special regimes regarding SMEs and agricultural activity, under the sixth directive, the place of supply of services became the place where a service is supplied shall be deemed to be the place where the supplier has established his business or has a fixed establishment from which the service is supplied, or in the absence of such a place of business or fixed establishment, the place where he has his permanent address or usually resides. So here we can see that we have the principle of origin, this general rule, which states that the place of a supply of services is where the supplier is established. Basic rule, and it follows what was since the first the aim of the then EEC to implement this principle of origin. But there's still a number of exceptions. Obviously, this, and we will see later on, the principle of origin has its practical difficulties, and so there were also a number of exceptions to the general rule, some of which continue to exist today. So the supplies of services connected with immovable property where is the place of supply, where the property is situated. So we do not follow anymore the general rule, and we have, in this case, we follow more of a principle of destination. Another exception, the transport services. So it's the place of supply is also not the place where the supplier is established, but the place where the transport takes place, having regard to the distances covered. In relation to cultural, artistic, sporting, scientific, entertainment or similar activities, including the activities of the organizers of such activities, and the supply of ancillary services, the place of supply of all these services is where those services are physically carried out. One must take into consideration that this kind of activities are very, very important within the then EEC and now European Union, in particular in some of its countries where there's a huge part of the economy that depends on the organization of such of events of this nature. So this was a particular important aspect to take into consideration. Another exception to the general rule, the hiring out of movable tangible property, with the exception of all forms of transport from one member state with a view to its being used in another member state, the place of supply of the service shall be the place of utilization. Also, the following list of services, when performed to customers established outside the community, or for taxable persons established in the community but not in the same country as the supplier, the place of supply shall be the place where the customer has established his business or has a fixed establishment to which the service is supplied. And we have services like transfer and assignments of copyrights, patents, licenses, trademarks. We have advertising services, services of consultants, of engineers, consultancy bureaus, lawyers, accountants, other similar services, as well as data processing and the supply of information. Obligations to refrain from pursuing or exercising in whole or in part a business activity, banking and financial and insurance transactions, the supply of staff, the services of agents who act in the name and for account of another. In all these cases, as one can see, the services are the place of supply is where the customer has established his business or as a fixed establishment. So we deviate in all these exceptions from the principle of origin, which is the main rule, to the principle of destination, for obvious practical reasons and others that we will address later. So the directive foresees also some derogations regarding the hiring out of movable tangible property. Overall, like I mentioned, although the general rule follows the principle of origin, the exceptions deviate from it towards the principle of destination. This, even though at this point in time, the purpose and the goal was still to walk towards the principle of origin. So that was still the main goal and what was considered to be attainable and the best solution. So between the principle of origin and the principle of destination, under the basis of which the place of supply is determined, a quick note in what were understood as the advantages and disadvantages of the principle of origin. Well, at the time it was seen as the principle that would ensure the goal of removal of the tax borders, allowing for the taxation of all intra-community transactions in the same way as if they were taxed in a single state. No discrimination between goods produced in another member state or in-house, simplicity. So obviously, to have a French business providing services to a French customer, taxable or business or consumer, or to an Italian customer, business or consumer, and to apply always the same rule to everybody. What a simple world that would be. I'm providing consultancy services, and the standard rate is 10%. My French business will apply 10% on its consultancy services to the business in France, to the business in Italy, to the consumer in France, to the consumer in Italy. What an incredibly simple world that would be. But then the easiest solutions are not always the best ones, and we seem to start seeing some problems in this simple world. There was obviously a lack of consistency because having the place of supply of a tax on consumption like VAT, where the supplier is established and not where the consumption occurs, it was not logical, it was not consistent. So taxation of income instead of consumption. So that was one of the inconsistencies of the principle of origin. Then difficulties in exercising the right of deduction. How to implement a system where the Italian business would be able to deduct the VAT charged on the consultancy services invoiced by the French business, and that multiplied by millions and billions of other transactions and other provisions of services. How to implement such a system that would allow for businesses to exercise the right of deduction without making sure that it would not be enormously complex, which probably wouldn't be possible, and without avoiding fraud to exist. Also, the principle of origin that this would mean a drop in the tax revenue of the member states that were net importers. A possible relocation of activities within the EU, especially if there were significant differences in the tax rates. So maybe the French business could consider, in particular if it was next to the Italian border, could consider moving to Italy if the tax rate on consultancy services was in Italy 5% instead of the 10% that was in France. So this could obviously create distortions and lead to relocation of activities. And that obviously was also caused by difficulties in harmonizing VAT rates across Europe. That was always been one of the main problems. Since the beginning and until today, there is no harmonization on VAT rates across Europe. The exemptions are not every time the same also. So there's no harmonization, and that under that assumption, that could also lead to, as I mentioned, a possible relocation of activities within the EU. So all these difficulties, all these problems made it that the principle of origin, although in an ideal world and from a certain perspective could see as a simple solution, had its inconsistencies and its many practical problems of implementation. So another step forward was the VAT directive, or the Common System of Value-Added Tax of 2006, and the VAT package that followed, which included 2 additional directives. And under this VAT package, goals were, again, the simplification and modernization of the existing rules, some further steps on harmonization, and obviously a new administrative cooperation between member states. By this time, member states also realized that they needed to, tax administrations needed to work a lot more together to prevent fraudsters from creating further distortions, and to make sure that the regulations were implemented and that taxpayers were compliant. And in the directive, the directives of this VAT package now advocated changes in the place of supply of services rules, as well as regarding the ones related with the VAT reimbursement of non-resident businesses. And these changes also led to the need of intensifying that cooperation between member states, especially due to the extension of the application of reverse charge. And that needed not only further information, so businesses needed to provide further information on the operations that were subject to reverse charge, thus informing each member state, and member states needed to compare the information they got from their taxpayers to realize if there was no fraud being implemented. But again, in relation to the place of supply, the rationale behind these legislative changes is clearly stated in the directive's preamble. They realize that the realization of the internal market, the globalization, the deregulation, and technology change have all combined to create enormous changes in the volume and pattern of trade in services. As usual, a reality moves a lot faster than legislation. And so it's always the legislation that is running towards reality and trying to capture the reality that is happening. So they say it's increasingly possible for a number of services to be supplied at a distance. In response, piecemeal steps have been taken to address this over the years, and many defined services are in fact at present taxed on the basis of the destination principle. So the proper functioning of the internal market requires the amendment of Council Directive 2006 on the common system of value-added tax as regards the place of supply of services, following the Commission strategy of modernization and simplification of the operation of the common VAT system. So it is clearly stated that they realized that reality and enormous changes it brought by the internal market, the globalization, the technology change, all that created enormous changes in the volume and pattern of trade in services, many of which could be supplied at a distance, which is a reality that, once again, these last 2 years, we have observed more intensely. So there was the need to, change the rules as regards the place of supply of services. And we see that we are moving towards a destination principle. So, in fact, although in accordance with the previous rules, the principle of origin prevailed, and the place of supply of services was where the supplier had his head office or permanent establishment. So that was the general rule. And such rule had several exceptions that was applied regardless of the purchaser. The new directive moves towards the principle of destination in what the place of supply of services is concerned. So we observe that there is a shift regarding the principle applied to the place of supply of services. And so under these two directives that changed the 2006 directive, we have two new general rules. B2B, the place of supply is located where the purchaser is established. So it's clearly a destination principle. Businesses include not only businesses established in the European Union, but also in third countries. And businesses from third countries can prove their status through the presentation of their VAT number or similar issued by the correspondent tax authority. Unlike what happened with the transaction of goods, that had a system, the VAT system, to confirm whether or not businesses were registered for intra-community transactions. In this case, regarding businesses from third countries, they could prove their status by the presentation of any document issued by the correspondent tax authority. This rule extended the application of reverse charge on the intra-community acquisition of more services, and that reduced the need for VAT registration and also, obviously, the associated costs. This allows for full competition between member states. So, company in country A does not benefit from a lower VAT rate on country B. The principle of neutrality, the VAT charge is eligible for deduction, obviously, provided that the acquirer, the purchaser, is eligible for deduction. So that will depend on the purchaser's status. And there is a huge administrative simplification and reduction in costs. No need for VAT registration. If you can consider that if a business, when a business wanted to promote its services outside the borders of the country of establishment, if that would mean that that business would need to VAT registered in all other countries, that would not be possible for some smaller businesses, and that would prevent them from growing their business outside their own borders, which is not, it would go against the principle and the goals of the single market. So the first rule is the business to business, and that is clearly stated as principle of destination. So as mentioned, and going back, the place of supply is where the purchaser is established. On the other hand, we have the business to consumer. And in this case, the place of supply of services is where the supplier is established. So in this case, there is no change. Any consumer will incur VAT at the rate of the country of establishment of the supplier, and obviously in accordance with the functioning of the tax, will not be able to deduct such VAT, which is the aim of VAT. So the tax is supposed to be borne by the consumer at the end of the stage. But although we have two main rules, we still have a number of special rules. So, and we need to, as always, we need to, for every situation that we have, we need to check if any of the special rules apply, and if they don't apply, then we go back to the general rules, and depending on the situation, whether we have a business to business or a business to consumer, we apply one of those general rules. So what special rules do we have here? Supply of services by intermediaries, B2C, is the place of supply is where the underlying transaction is located. So it follows the main transaction. The supply of services connected with immovable property, again, like before, where the immovable property is located. The supply of services regarding the transport of passengers, it's where the place of supply is where the transport takes place proportionate to the distances covered. The supply of services, B2C, regarding the transport of goods, except for the intra-community transport of goods. So it's where the transport takes place proportionate to the distances covered. In the case of intra-community transport of goods, it is relevant to place of departure, because that will be the place of supply. Some further exceptions: the supply of restaurant and catering services, where the services are physically carried out. So whenever we go to a restaurant in France, it's they're going to charge French VAT, regardless of the fact that I am a business or an end consumer. Nevertheless, when these services are carried out on board of ships, planes, or trains, it is relevant to place of departure. So in that case, it will be the place of supply will be the place of departure. In relation to the supply of cultural, artistic, scientific, educational, and entertainment and similar services, including the provision of services by its organizers, the place of supply is where the services are carried out. So that was the first wording of this exception. But as of 2011, this rule was only applicable in its entire extent to the B2C services. So in relation to the B2B, the rule only applies to the services regarding the admission to those events. So in relation to this exception, as of 2011, B2B is the place of supply is where the services are carried out, but only in relation to the admission. And for B2C, the rule is in relation to everything, so it's where the services are carried out, not only the admission, but any other services. The supply of ancillary transport services or valuations of and work on movable tangible property, B2C, is where the services are executed. In relation to the hiring of means of transport, B2C, other than short-term hiring, as of 2013, the place of supply is where the customer is established or has a permanent address or resides. The exception, hiring of pleasure boats. The place of supply is where it is put at the disposal of the customer. Another major change as of 2015 was in relation of the telecommunication, broadcasting, and electronic services. These services are to be considered located where the customer has his residence, irrespective of the supplier's place of establishment, EU or non-EU. Under this rule, the supplier is subject to registration in all member states where their customers reside, which would be obviously very burdensome to businesses if they needed to establish in all member states. And the kind of services that we're talking about, like broadcasting, it's like, or telecommunication, it's likely that the business that provides this kind of services provides them to a number of customers in different locations in different EU member states. So, as of 2015, the suppliers could comply with this obligation through the mini one-stop shop, and by doing that, they would avoid the need for numerous VAT registrations and the associated costs of such a solution. Well, but the evolution of this problematic of the place of supply and VAT in general does not stop. Reality evolves quite rapidly. The way businesses do business changes quite rapidly. And in the meantime, the Commission launches the Green Paper on the future of VAT and draws some necessary conclusions. Like someone called it, the romantic myth of the principle of origin was finally abandoned, because one realized that it required an enormous harmonization of VAT rates, which we all understand has not been attained, not even today, and it's unlikely that it will be attained in the near future. It also implicated the need to implement a compensation system to ensure the allocation of VAT revenue to the member state of consumption, and some lack of trust between member states was not in line with this with the implementation of such a compensation system. The member states would need to depend on one another to get the relevant part of their VAT revenue. So pragmatically, it was not attainable. So in 2016, following that reflection on what was going on regarding the VAT, place of supply, and other issues, the European Commission approved an action plan on VAT towards a single EU VAT area. And the most important principles were short-term measures to tackle VAT fraud, update the framework for VAT rates and set out options to grant member states greater flexibility in setting them, and plans to simplify VAT rules for e-commerce and for a comprehensive VAT package to make life easier for SMEs. Two new directives, Directive 2017-2455 of December 5, and Regulation 2017-2459 of December 5 introduced new rules regarding the place of supply of telecommunication services, radio and television broadcasting services, and electronically supplied services. So what are those changes brought by this new set of regulation that once again affected, amongst other things, the place of supply of services? So the supply of telecommunication services, radio and television broadcasting services, and electronically supplied services. B2C, so the supply of these services to consumers. The general rule would be where the consumer is established. Again, we have the principle of destination, but there is an exception. The place of supply would be where the supplier is established, provided that the supplier is established in only one member state. The services are supplied to consumers residing in any member state other than the member state of the supplier, and the total value exclusive of VAT of the supplies does not exceed 10,000 euros, not in the current calendar year, and also not in the preceding calendar year. So the principle of origin ceases to be applied as of the date the supplies exceed the threshold. So this possibility to still apply the principle of origin in these cases would merely is specifically directed to small businesses that do not have a high value of operations, and so further registration would be too burdensome and would mean a level of cost which would not be in line to the size of the business. So until up to 10,000 euro, the supplier, the place of supply of these services, and under this regulation, so the supplier only established in one member state, and the consumers residing in any member state other than member state of the supplier. In this situation, the place of supply is where the supplier is established, any other situation where the consumer is established. Okay. So it also becomes possible for businesses not established in the EU who provide telecommunication services, radio or television broadcasting services, and electronic services to consumers established in the EU to register at MOS, even though they are registered or required to register for VAT purposes. So it becomes increasingly less complex to be compliant with European regulation regarding this particular aspect of the provision of these services. In all situations, every time a non-EU business provided services to EU businesses, to EU consumers, the fact that at some point they needed to VAT registered in all the countries where they had any operations was, of course, costly, was complex, and it perhaps prevented them from doing business here, to develop their business in the EU. So this is a huge change, as it provides the possibility for these businesses established outside the EU to, in relation to the provision of these particular services, to register at the main one-stop shop and to be VAT compliant through that registration. So the fact was that according to previous rules, if those businesses were VAT registered in any member state, they could not register for the purpose of MOS, being required to register in each member state to which they would provide a type of supply of services. So that is an additional simplification. And as of January 2019, it becomes possible for businesses under these conditions to register in the extra-union regime, thus therefore complying with all obligations of this regime. In line with this 2017 2455 directive of the Council and Directive 2019-1995 of the Council, as of this year, as of the 1st of July of 2021, and this represents another move forward in terms of place of supply, and in particular, how to implement the VAT obligations in Europe. As of the 1st of July, it was, in fact, it should have been as of the 1st of January, but due to the COVID, this was postponed to the 1st of July of 2021. The scope of the one-stop shop is extended to all B2C supplies of services that are located in member states where the provider is not established. So we move forward. We no longer have the mini one-stop shop. We have the one-stop shop. So we have extended and enlarged the scope of this one-stop shop, and we did it to all B2C supplies of services that are located in member states where the provider is not established. So within this OSS, we have the union scheme, and this union regime allows for businesses who have a registered office or a permanent establishment or a domicile in the EU to comply with their VAT obligations relating to the provision of services made to consumers, the later case when the provider is not established in the member state of consumption. So this is something that is completely changing the way that businesses need to be compliant in relation to their VAT obligations within the European Union. We can see that a lot of businesses are closing down their VAT registrations in other countries and choosing the OSS to be compliant with their VAT obligations. The OSS has also a non-union scheme, and this regime is applicable to businesses not established in the EU, and this allows them to be compliant regarding the obligations arising from all the B2B services that are considered to be located in the EU. Obviously, the one-stop shop is not only used for the VAT compliance of the provision in relation to the provision of services. The OSS has other goals, and it can also be used for distant sales of goods within the European Union and domestic sales of goods by deemed suppliers. But that is not today's theme of discussion, but so that you know that this scheme can also be used for other purposes. in the one-stop shop, the member state of identification is the member state in which the taxable person is registered for MOS, and in which it declares, or for us, and which it declares and pays the VAT that is due in the state members of consumption. So in each business can only have one member state of identification per regime: union scheme, non-union scheme, and import scheme. Okay, so what is the state of the art of the place of supply? Having gone through all this evolution in terms of regulation, of EU regulation, where we started so many years ago with a state of mind that included mostly the principle of origin. So the supplier would charge VAT in regards and to the rules of the place where he was established. So the place of supply was the place of establishment of the supplier. So we came a long way since we started so many years ago with that thought in mind. So the current state of the art, where are we now today regarding the place of supply of services? As mentioned, we have those two main rules. In the B2B, in the business-to-business provision of services, the main rule, the general rule, is the place of supply is where the purchaser is established, or as a fixed establishment, or has his address, or usually resides. So this principle of destination. The second general rule, B2C, the place where the supplier is established. So the place of supply is where the supplier is established. And then we have the exceptions. So we now have those two main rules that guide us, and we have a number of exceptions. Let's go and see the exceptions that we have today. So in terms of supply of services by intermediaries, in the case of B2C, the place of supply is where the underlying transaction is considered to be located. So the place of supply follows the main transaction. In relation to the supply of services connected with immovable property, we have it is where the immovable property is located. So that is the exception. In the case of supply of transport, it's the place of supply is where the transport takes place proportionate to the distances covered. In relation to the transport of goods, other than intra-community acquisition of goods, transport of goods, B2C, the place of supply is where the transport takes place proportionate to the distances covered. The intra-community, in the case of the services of intra-community transport of goods, B2C, it's what is relevant is the place of departure. The place of supply in relation to B2B, the place of supply of services in respect to the admission of cultural, artistic, and sporting events is where those events actually take place. So, and in this case, B2B, the place of supply of services in respect to cultural, artistic, sporting, it only refers to admission. Everything else should reverse charge should apply. But for the same events, the place of supply of those services and the ancillary services related to those cultural, artistic, sporting, educational activities fairs, exhibitions, all that. In the case of B2C, is the place of supply is where those activities actually take place. And in the case of B2C, there's a few activities, a few provision of services where the place of supply is also where the services actually take place. Ancillary transport activities and valuations of work on movable, tangible property. Then, the place of supply of restaurant and catering services, other than those that are carried out on board of ships, aircraft or trains, is where the services are physically carried out. So, place of supply of restaurant and catering services, the place of supply is where the services are physically carried out. Of course, if those same services are provided on board of ships, aircraft or trains, the place of supply within during the section of a passenger transport operation effected within the community, the place of supply will be the place of departure. The hiring of means of transport, short-term hiring, and short-term hiring is up to 30 days, and in the case of boats, up to 90 days, where the means of transport is actually put at the disposal of the customer. The place of hiring, other than short-term hiring to consumers, is where the customer is established or usually resides. However, there is also another exception, the place of hiring a pleasure boat, other than the short-term hiring, in terms of B2C, is where the pleasure boat is actually put at disposal of the customer. As mentioned, the supplies of restaurant and catering services for consumption on boards of ships and aircrafts and trains. So it's the point of departure of the passenger is the place of supply. And finally, as mentioned, the place of supply of B2C telecommunication services, the radio and TV broadcasting services, and electronically supplied services. The place of supply is where the consumer is established, whereas his permanent address or usually resides. The place of supply B2C to consumers outside the community, where the consumer has the place of supply is where the consumer has his permanent address. And there is a number of services to which this applies, like transfers of copyrights, patents, advertising services, consultants, obligation to refrain from pursuing an activity, banking services, supply of staff, and so on. So this is the state of the art regarding the place of supply of services. This is the current situation. So we have two main rules, and we have the exceptions. And in relation to how to be compliant, we now have the one-stop shop for the in relation to B2C provision of services that will allow businesses to be VAT compliant through that registration. Mostly and that covers, in relation to B2C, the telecommunication, the radio and TV broadcasting services, and the electronically supplied services. So this is the state of the art. But as always, and just as an example, the rules and the exceptions to the rules are often interpreted in very different ways. And the the ECJ, the European Court of Justice, has been very important through the years, and some of the changes in the VAT legislation have been also the result of these ECJ's resolutions and opinions that were brought to the attention of the court by businesses and tax authorities. So the fact that we have this number of rules and that we have them clearly stated in the legislation that doesn't mean that there are not a wide number of difficulties to implement the regulation, mostly because obviously sometimes there are derogations and VAT authorities have different views on certain aspects of the legislation. Member states have different views on certain aspects of the legislation. Businesses also have different views on that. Reality works a lot faster than the legislation, and that brings also, and every time, tension between authorities, businesses, and sometimes all that is needed is to have some certainty, which is always difficult to attain. But I bring you just an example of what the implementation of this regulation can bring in practical terms, and you obviously know this even better than I do, as when we have to deal with clients and we have to deal with the specific situations. It is the case that many times the situations that we have do not fall exactly in what is stated in the legislation. The legislation never covers all the situations, and difficulties arise when we, for the implementation of any legislation, and VAT is a clear case of that. I bring this example just to show one small aspect of what it means, the application of VAT regulation, and the gray areas and the different interpretation that always and usually happens. So I bring you this case. This is the recent, it's 2 years case of the ECJ, and it refers to this Swedish company called Consulterna, a company that was established in Sweden, owned by a professional association for accounting, management, and salary consultants. This association provided educational and vocational training seminars to professionals established in Sweden. The attendees needed to register and pay in advance for the training seminars, and the seminars took place in Sweden and in other member states. And Consulterna requested an opinion from the Revenue Law Commission of Sweden to rule on whether the place of supply should be considered to be Sweden or the member state where the seminars took place. And the Swedish authority was of the opinion that such seminars were to be regarded as supplied in Sweden, even though they were physically taken place elsewhere in other member states. So under their opinion, Article 44, rather than Article 53, should be applied. So Article 44 is the main rule, business to business, general rule. The place of supply is where the supplier is established. So Article 44 rather than Article 53 should apply, and therefore Swedish VAT applied. The ICAI was obviously Consulterna was not happy with this opinion, and the ICAI was asked to issue their opinion on this, and was asked to decide on must the expression admission to events in Article 53 be interpreted as meaning that it covers a service in the form of a 5-day course on accountancy, which is applied solely to taxable persons and requires advance registration and payment. And the ICAI reasoning was basically mostly based on three aspects of the question. After which they reached their conclusion, and those three aspects of the question were: first, Article 44 contains a general rule for determining the place where services to taxable persons are supplied for tax purposes. Article 53 makes specific different provision in the case of educational services. So the rules in place concerning the place of supply aim for taxation to, as far as possible, take place where the supplies of services are consumed. And third, a service in respect of educational events constitutes a single, albeit composite supply, with essential elements of a close physical link with the place where the event actually happens, calling for the application of Article 53. And based on these reasonings, the conclusion was that the expression supplies in respect of admission to educational events stated in Article 53 of the Directive on the Common System of Value-Added Tax should be interpreted as meaning that it covers a service supplied solely to taxable persons whose essential elements consist of selling rights for individuals to be admitted to a professional educational seminar extending over one or several days, where that seminar takes place in a specified location and its subject matter is defined in advance, which is for the national court to determine. It is, the court also concluded that it is immaterial whether all customers make information, such as their fiscal identification, data available to the supplier. It is immaterial whether the service in question requires advance registration or payment. It is immaterial that the service is offered only to a specific group or to the general public. It is immaterial the fact that the service is taxed in the member state where the event in question takes place, and that leads to an additional administrative burden for the supplier or its customers. So the rule to be followed here, and the court explained that, is the rule of Article 53. So what this business, Consulterna, was charging for the taxable persons attending the seminar in different places. So the local VAT was due in each member state where they were physically organizing the seminars, and so the place of supply was in each one of the member states they were organizing those seminars, and not where the supplier was established. That is to say, the supply of these services, of these training seminars, was not in Sweden, but it was in all the member states where those training seminars were actually being executed and taken place. So this is just an example of the many questions that arise whenever we are trying to determine the place of supply and applying the regulation that we have in place. The reality is not always black and white, it's mostly gray, and the application of the regulation is always a big challenge to all involved. And in relation to the place of supply, a number of questions arise many times because, as mentioned, and this applies to any other aspect of the VAT regulation, reality evolves very, very rapidly, and not always the regulation is in line with the progression of reality and new situations that it brings to businesses, to consultants, to authorities. So this was just an example of how the interpretation of the regulation can lead to different views on the same subject. I would now would like to thank you for your attention to my presentation. I tried to provide an overview of what has been the evolution of the regulation of the place of supply in EU legislation. We came a long way from the principle of origin to the principle of destination, and this is the result of obviously of many different experiences that were felt by the authorities, by the legislators, by the businesses, by the courts, and where we are now with these two main rules and these exceptions and this new tool of the one-stop shop to provide it to businesses for them to be VAT compliant. This is something that has just started. One-stop shop started being used on the 1st of July. I'm sure that we will have a number of challenges that will be coming from that in the next months. Many issues will arise from that for sure. And it will be interesting that in a few months we will sort of try to understand where we are and how this new tool, the one-stop shop, is being used in particular for the VAT compliance issues related with the place of supply of services. So I thank you very much for your attention, and also I thank for the Rajendra to have invited me to this webinar, and I would be glad to exchange some views with all of you regarding this theme, this subject, and to hear from you also what is the state of the art of the place of supply of services in India, with its many realities and differences across the country. So thank you very much. Shukriya.
Thank you, Fatima, for that wonderful presentation that you took us through for the last about 60 to 90 minutes. In fact, when we compare the place of supply provisions within the EU with that of India, we are more or less on the same pedestal. The educational services, the professional services, the transportation services, etc. In the European Union, it is between one country and another country. But it is in India, it is within the country, but then as the country is separated, what you may call, by the states, the levy of the CGST, SGST that we call, the central tax and the state tax. Now, that is levied when the services are supplied within one territory, within one state in India. If the services are supplied from one state in India to another state in India, then the concept of IGST, the Integrated Goods and Services Tax, takes place. What happens in India is that the revenue when the CGST and SGST is applied is equally shared between the central and the state. But when IGST is charged, 41% alone goes to the states and 59% is retained by the central government. So the levy, the charge itself is extremely important. What is to be charged? Is it, if suppose the tax rate is 18%, one good thing in India is that across the country, the rate is one. But that is not so in the European Union. You have different, you are still struggling with various different rates within the European Union. When France has one rate, Germany may have a different rate, Netherlands may have different. So as a VAT practitioner, how do you handle this different rate structure? When suppose you're dealing with, let us say, 10 European states, 10 countries of the European Union, 10 member countries. How do you basically keep track of these changes in rates and how frequent are those changes? Can you just share your views with our listeners, please?
Well, it's not easy. Obviously, the changes in rates are published by the European Union and the Commission, and through the VAT authorities portals. Those are communicated to the Commission. But it's difficult to keep track on the changes of the VAT rates, and those rates are not always easy to understand, in the sense that what is not a standard VAT rate, but then the lower rates, what is subject to those lower rates. It's not many times it's not difficult to it's not easy to understand. Because what is, for example, bread is subject to a lower rate, but what is to be considered bread? What is bread? So it can go deep as that. What is to be considered yogurt if it is subject to a lower rate? So if when you go deep into that, there's a world of details to understand and to know. And if you, although there are some general regulation about those concepts, they're not. Many of them are not exactly the same all over the European Union, and even when they are. I mean, you need to, it's not as easy as to, okay, bread is 5%, but then you need to understand what is bread. And there is a number of things that are considered to be bread, and an equally a number of things that are not considered to be bread. And so you need to be an expert on bread to understand where the lower rate is applied. So all this, obviously, it makes it quite complex to apply on a practical basis. And of course, one could say, well, let's just apply the same rule for everything, and we will avoid this complexity. The different tax rates are there for. Because they are the result of social policies. And it's from a political point of view, it would be very complicated to change that. I mean, if we have, for example, medical services that are usually exempt, it would be very, very complicated to say, okay, medical services are now 25% or 23% or 21%, or it applies the standard VAT rate. So this, in fact, it's from it's not just VAT is not just technical aspects. It's a lot more than that, because as we all know, VAT is used as a weapon, a policy weapon by governments, especially when they need to quickly collect more revenue. VAT is the weapon of choice, and we know that because it brings results a lot more quicker than
Yes.
if you implement any changes on corporate tax or personal income tax. So the question of the tax rates, and it's really a world apart. And when you need to analyze a specific issue and to understand what rate applies in each country, you need to go deep into the concept. You need to go deep into the concepts of what to which the tax rate is applied. You need to understand, okay, what is this item exactly? What does it cover? It's not as simple as yogurt. It's not just the thing that is called yogurt by the supermarket. Maybe they are calling it the wrong name for commercial reasons. And in fact, it's not yogurt, and they're applying the wrong VAT rate because they didn't read the big files or the big concepts about yogurt.
Yeah.
So if you want to go really deep on this, you can make a training seminar just on the VAT rates of bread or yogurt, and you can spend hours talking about it, and still in the end maybe you don't understand everything about what it's bread and what it's yogurt.
What is yogurt? Exactly.
And you're not sure on regarding a particular product that is put before you, if the VAT rate of a yogurt should be applied or not. It's because obviously, as I mentioned, in relation to the place of supply of services and to many other aspects, reality evolves a lot faster than legislation and regulation. And if someone decides to invent a kind of yogurt because it puts pepper on it and it gives a different flavor, maybe that is not to be considered a yogurt from a VAT perspective, because it does not fall within the concept that was established for VAT purposes.
Thank you.
It's really a wide subject.
Yes, and in fact, I was also surprised to note that you still have the multiple concept of origin-based taxation somewhere, and also in some form or the other, and then of course the consumption-based levy. So that is interesting, isn't it? How do you deal with that basically as a VAT practitioner? Because I did find some exceptions where the origin rule is there, and so how do you basically look into the place of supply when you deal with such kind of interpretations?
Well, the first thing is obviously we need to look into the exceptions. Overall, what we've seen is that although at start we were the aim was the principle of origin, over the years it was understood that for a number of reasons that I also mentioned in the presentation, the principle of origin was not attainable and was not the best solution. And so over time, the legislation deviated from the principle of origin to the principle of destination. As always, we need to look into the exceptions that are mentioned in the legislation and see if they apply to our specific case. And so we start, like in this case that I brought your attention to regarding the ECJ on this Swedish case. So the reasoning of the Swedish authority was not a correct one, as they saw the general rule and they jump into the general rule immediately without seeing the specific rule that applied in this case. So we need to go to the specific rules, which it's sometimes it's not easy because then we have. If I could give you the example of this Swedish case, also we have this admission then we can ask what is admission. When we have the case, the specific case. So, what is admission to the training seminar? What can we consider to be an admission? So, in the wording of the law, everything seems so clear. Admission to a training seminar, and then we see that there is a number of services included, and it will depend obviously on how they are. Sometimes on how they are charged to the customer to decide whether or not they are considered to be admission to that training seminar. So one needs to address the specific cases and the exceptions mentioned in the legislation and see if our specific case falls into one of those exceptions. And if they don't, then we go back to the general rules and we apply the general rules. But when we address the exceptions of the legislation, as I mentioned, there is always a number of questions that we need to address. And like in this case, this was the admission to an event that took place in another member state. But what then we have the real invoice before our eyes, and we need to check whether or not what is being charged there is really just the admission or it is something else. So this really brings a number of issues that are more complex sometimes, because when somebody is making an invoice or making a contract to provide a training seminar, they're not looking into the legislation, they're not looking into the articles of the directive, they're doing their business, and they're obviously drawing a contract and an invoice in accordance with what they are providing to their customers, and they're not looking into the directive. So we have to look into the specifics, and we accountants, consultants need to check and check the specifics and go to the exceptions and see if they can provide an answer to our specific case.
Yeah, that's fine, Fatima. In fact, office, have you received any questions from our participants?
Yes, sir, there are one or two questions. One or two questions we have received.
Yeah, can you read it out? Maybe, Fatima, you can come out of the screen share so that we can... Yes, Madam Smita, you can... the questions, maybe you can read the questions or you can share the screen.
Yeah, I can share the screen. In fact, Fatima ma'am, we have also shared with her how to read the questions. She herself can also, if she wants, she can also see the questions.
I can see some of the questions. So in terms of digital software, the place of supply obviously depends if it is a business or a consumer. If it is a consumer, then it's the place where the consumer is established, and the business where the business is established. So in a B2B, we would have the general rule, and in a B2C, we would have the exception. So the place of supply would be where the consumer is established, and currently this can be the compliance can be done through the one-stop shop in these cases, because it's included in the digital services. In relation to tax, there is one question regarding additional compliance and tax burden on the supplier in case the place of supply is in other member states. So in those cases, the place of supply is where the purchaser is established. and there is no need for registration. There's this simplification. There is another question regarding for whether place of supply and location of supplier is made are one of the same in EU VAT. I don't entirely understand this question.
Rita madam, can you just read that so that I'll be able to...
location of supplier.
Yes, the querist is asking whether place of supply and location of supplier for the purposes of registration are one and the same in EU VAT?
Registration as a VAT dealer in the EU, that is what is the question the queries is asking you. Whether what is the trigger point for registration? Is it the location of the supplier? And what is the other part, Smita?
No, it's the place of supply. It's the
place of supply. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Now I understood. Yeah. Okay. Good. I think those were the questions.
In fact, in the EU, you have a very different concept of registration. It depends on the location of the supplier, also sometimes the place of supply that triggers registration. That was the question which the concerned person was asking. And sometimes I think you have a country-wise different rule when it comes to registration of the VAT suppliers in EU. Am I right?
So obviously, a registered business, an established business needs obviously to register for VAT purposes. So there is the place of establishment that triggers the registration as an established business. But then, as we have it here, for example, for the provision of those electronic services, the place of supply may trigger an additional registration. Because if you are providing those services to other member states, that can trigger an additional registration, which nowadays can be done through the one-stop shop. So, but that means an additional registration to be complied. Of course, another possibility is if businesses do not want to choose the one-stop shop, they can go and register in every country where they are providing those services, and they need to VAT register there. But the one-stop shop has been designed to avoid all those VAT registrations, and so it wouldn't make much sense if businesses would prefer now to VAT register in all 27 members instead of using this new tool of the one-stop shop that allows them to be compliant through this one single registration point, besides their own registration as established businesses. So in fact, we have these two registrations. Obviously, there may be some services, there may be some situations not covered by the one-stop shop, namely in relation to the provision of the sales of goods, that may trigger still some VAT registrations that are not covered by the one-stop shop. So eventually, one can get to a situation where we have obviously VAT registration in their own member state of establishment, the one-stop shop registration, and eventually some VAT registrations in other member states triggered by situations that are not covered by the one-stop shop. Still, there's still some complexity, but so it doesn't seem that simple. But I think we all can say that with the one-stop shop, the level of complexity has diminished, and businesses are way better than they were before with all those VAT registrations across Europe. So,
but as you rightly said, complexities will be there because VAT is a dynamic tax and it continuously changes. So there will be complexities and wherever there are complexities, wherever there are complexities, there will be professionals, there will be VAT practitioners like you and me. Thank you very much. It was nice hearing you, Fatima. It was a wonderful presentation. We just got to know the various aspects of the place of supply, and one thing is common: complexities. It's the same everywhere. It's the same as it's EU or India or any other part of the world. GST or VAT, complex subjects and subject to change frequently. Thank you very much, and thank you all the participants. Thank you all the participants for being with us. Thank you, Office, for your wonderful support. And once again, thank you, Fatima. We'll have more of you in the coming days and months.
Thank you very much. It was
thank you. And have a great day. And stay safe. Thank you. Thanks for that, Shukriya. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
हाँ जी, बंद कर दीजिए.